Okay, everybody, welcome to our latest online talk, which has been held from a hotel in Pontefract. Well, Helen Cooke is in Nantwich, but I'm speaking from a hotel in Pontefract in Yorkshire because of family circumstances I won't go into here. So welcome to everybody. We've got 37 people already, which is a really great number, given by the July especially. And of course, as per usual, we will begin with a sort of little bit of a chat from Helen for about 3 or 4 minutes, where she's talked about herself and her talk. And then by that time, hopefully, everybody or nearly everybody will be here, and we'll start the talk properly. In addition to the talk, I'm only about 10 miles as the crow flies from Joseph Priestley's birthplace in Birstall. And sorry, I'm just still admitting people here. I'm about 10 miles from Joseph Priestley's birthplace in Birstall as the crow flies. And yesterday, I actually went there and took a couple of pictures. So immediately after, well, not immediately after Helen's talk, after Helen's talk and all the fascinating questions you've got for her, I will give a very, very short presentation about Joseph Priestley's birthplace. Incredibly short. Blink and you will miss it. Okay, righto. Welcome, Helen. Good to see you. Would you like to talk about yourself for a couple of minutes or so, 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll start to talk properly.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for the introduction, and I'm looking forward to seeing your pictures of Priestley's, the area where Priestley was born in due course. Many people here, I'm sure, have heard me speak at these events before, but I'm Helen Cooke. I am now retired, but I'm a volunteer at Nantwich Museum in Cheshire. And prior to that, I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry in the USA and also in Stevenage in Hertfordshire. And before that, I worked for 20 years actually at UMIS, the University of Manchester. And I started off obviously as a chemist and a PhD in the history of science and technology, focusing primarily on chemical information and the history of chemical information. So that's my background. Shall I just forge ahead now then, Peter?
Okay.
Right. Okay.
Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Helen Cooke, who's introduced herself to talk to us about the 250th anniversary of Joseph's discovery of oxygen, which is not today, but certainly only a few days either side of today. Anyway, she'll be talking about that 250th anniversary of Joseph Priestley of oxygen. Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a map, and this is a map of Priestley's travels, which shows that he actually moved around quite a lot whilst he was during his career. In fact, his whole life he moved around, not just in the UK, but he also went over to the USA, which many people in the audience today probably know about. But this map was created by a member of Nantwich Museum's research group for an exhibition we put on in 2019 during the International Year of the Periodic Table. I'm not expecting you to remember all the information on here, but it's really just to give you a flavour of the different places that Priestley went to. The map itself was reproduced in a new edition of Priestley's memoirs, which is pictured bottom right on the screen. And this was produced by the Priestley House Museum in Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and published in 2021. I have no commercial interest in this, but it is an excellent publication, nicely presented, and with very helpful notes expanding on Priestley's own text. So it's not terribly expensive either, and you can order it from all the usual online resources that are available. So we're very fortunate to have Priestley's memoirs as an aid to researching his life and work. I'm a volunteer at Nantwich Museum, and I have a particular interest in Priestley as he lived and worked in Nantwich from 1758 to 1761. But aside from that, I think Priestley's time in Nantwich was very significant, as it was here that he laid the foundations for his future scientific work. Although he was appointed as a nonconformist minister in Nantwich, he established a school soon after he arrived, and this was the first teaching that he'd actually done in his career. Bear in mind, he was only about 25 years old when he came to Nantwich. And he basically discovered that he enjoyed teaching. He was able to purchase some books and what he refers to as philosophical instruments. So, for example, a small air pump and an electrical machine. He taught his senior pupils to keep the equipment in order and encouraged them to entertain their parents and friends by demonstrating experiments and giving lectures. So as well as possibly giving the first ever science lessons, and a couple of authors have mentioned this actually, that Priestley's lessons here may well have been the very first ever done. It's a little hard to believe, but maybe that's the case. But he was also definitely a pioneer of science outreach and very inclusive in allowing people to participate in the teaching of science as well themselves. So after Nantwich, Priestley was appointed as a teacher at Warrington Academy, and while there he extended his connections with influential and learned people. First of all, I've got a few people highlighted at the top in the red box. Richard Price, who was a long-term friend and supporter of Priestley over the years. He was a Welsh moral philosopher, a non-conformist preacher, as was Priestley, of course, a mathematician and a long-term friend and supporter of Priestley in lots of different contexts. John Canton was an English experimenter and physicist, and he introduced Priestley to Benjamin Franklin, which is a very important relationship for Priestley at the time. Not mentioned here, but Matthew Turner of Liverpool visited Warrington Academy whilst Priestley was there to lecture on chemistry. And this event could be credited with starting Priestley's interest in chemistry. The article also discusses Priestley's election into the Royal Society in 1766, where he was awarded for his work on electricity. So at the bottom in the box at the bottom, it says, henceforward, his life became a curious blend, the man of science on the one hand, the champion of civil and religious liberty on the other. And it's true to say that Priestley was definitely a polymath with lots of different interests that he managed to juggle throughout his life. So after Warrington, Priestley moved to Leeds, where from 1767 to 1722, his day job was as a minister at Mill Hill Chapel in Leeds. A lot of Priestley's experiments with gases were done whilst he was there, and this table shows the gases that Priestley discovered or worked with, not all necessarily whilst he was in Leeds, I should stress, but these are the most important gases that he worked with over time. He didn't discover them all. Joseph Black discovered carbon dioxide and Henry Cavendish discovered hydrogen, but Priestley certainly worked with those two gases. Priestley, it has to be said, Priestley didn't always know what he'd actually discovered. While at Mill Hill Chapel in Leeds, Priestley lived next door to a brewery, and the fermentation process provided a readily available supply of carbon dioxide, or as he would have called it, mephitic air or fixed air, and it was available in very large quantities. So how could Priestley possibly resist the temptation to do some work with that gas? So this was in his spare time, don't forget, because he must have had some spare time because he was supposedly a minister full-time, I think, at Mill Hill Chapel. But he developed apparatus which could impregnate still water with fixed air. And he found that the fixed air acidified and sweetened the water, and that the water became fizzy. So Priestley can therefore be credited with inventing soda water, even though he didn't commercialize it. The person who, of course, did commercialize it was Johann Schweppe, and that was in the 19th century, I believe. The experimental details of creating a solution of carbon dioxide in water to produce soda water is described in this 1772 pamphlet that's on the screen at the moment. Priestley also presented a paper on this to the Royal Society and was awarded the Copley Medal for his work on Pyrmont water and different kinds of air. He also postulated that Pyrmont water and possibly eating carbon dioxide-rich vegetables could prevent scurvy. And in 1771, he was invited to join one of Captain Cook's voyages, but didn't end up going. I think the rationale being that this wonderful water would perhaps have prevented the scurvy or treated the scurvy amongst the members of the crew. But there's a bit of a saga behind that, which I won't go into, but anyway, Priestley didn't go. It's possible that the benefits of Parmont water may have been tested for efficacy on the voyage, but I'm not sure of the outcomes, or even if that is definitely the case. The record of Priestley's work on Parmont water was read to the Royal Society and published in Philosophical Transactions in 4 parts in March 1772. Sorry, I think I've skipped ahead a little bit there. Sorry, yes, I have. I've just gone back one slide. One observation that he recorded in his text on the left side of the screen reads, by the process described in my pamphlet, fixed air may be readily incorporated. Sorry, skipping ahead. I was on the right slide after all when I moved it on. Sorry, apologies for that. On the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see that there's some text, and this is Priestley's own writings. And he says one observation he recorded is in the text it's in the left-hand side, and it reads, by the process described in my pamphlet, fixed air may be readily incorporated with wine, beer, and almost any other liquor whatever. And when beer, wine, or cider become flat or dead, which is the consequence of the escape of fixed air they contained, they may be revived by this means, that is to say, by impregnation by fixed air. And just in case you're interested, the picture is actually of the Het Anker Brewery in Mechelen in Belgium, which is only a short trip from Brussels if you're ever in the area and looking for some nice beer. Now, perhaps Priestley discovered oxygen without realizing. He always had a curious mind, and although he didn't isolate oxygen until 1774, some say that he accidentally discovered it sooner, perhaps even when he was 11 years old, when he performed his first scientific experiment. In this experiment, he confined spiders in bottles and seeing how long they could live without fresh air. Now, this may, of course, not have been a scientific pursuit. He could perhaps just have been a typical 11-year-old boy messing around with insects and creatures that he might have discovered in his own house. But it's nice to think, perhaps, isn't it, that Priestley was aware a little bit more of the science that was going on, but we don't know. Priestley did, however, obtain oxygen in 1771. So that was a couple of years before he officially discovered oxygen, the 1774 anniversary. And Priestley obtained oxygen in 1771, and the way he did this was by heating saltpeter or niter, potassium nitrate, but he confused the air that he obtained with what he referred to as common air, or we would just refer to as air, or the air that's at the atmosphere around us. In one quantity of air, which I got from saltpeter, a candle not only burned, but the flame was increased, and something was heard like a hissing, similar to the decrepitation of niter in an open fire. It could also be argued that Priestley inadvertently discovered oxygen through the work that he did on photosynthesis. And just to read from Priestley's text again, one might have imagined that, since common air is necessary to vegetable as well as to animal life, both plants and animals had affected it in the same manner. And I own I had that expectation when I first put a sprig of mint into a glass jar, standing inverted in a vessel of water. But when it had continued growing there for some months, I found that the air would neither extinguish a candle, nor was it at all inconvenient to a mouse, which I put into it. So photosynthesis, a little bit more on photosynthesis. This apparatus pictured on the left-hand side of the screen here, that we had this on display at Nantwich Museum in 2019 during the exhibition that we were doing about Priestley and the International Year of the Periodic Table. And again, we repeated it during a science festival that we held at the museum in 2023. This experiment demonstrates the fixing of carbon dioxide in water by a plant, in this case pondweed, to generate energy and to release oxygen. And if you look very, very carefully, you might just be able to see a few little bubbles of oxygen appearing in the pondweed there. And so our visitors and our volunteers at the museum were quite fascinated by this, keeping an eye on what was going on for the duration of the exhibitions. While Priestley was in Leeds, he was becoming increasingly well known. And from what I've been saying earlier, you'll realize that he was already publishing information in pamphlets and also in journals as well. And he was starting to get headhunted. As I mentioned before, he had already been recruited to go on Captain Cook's second voyage, but that did fall through. But word had obviously got around that Priestley had something to offer. Priestley was recommended to the Earl of Shelburne by Richard Price. And Richard Price is the person I mentioned who Priestley first met whilst he was at Warrington. Shelburne was obviously very impressed by Priestley's credentials, and he visited Priestley in Leeds. So he did quite a long trip. He came all the way from Calne in Wiltshire, presumably. And after some deliberation, Priestley accepted an offer to become Shelburne's librarian and literary companion. And Priestley was invited to take up the role in 1772, whilst he was obviously still at Leeds, and he moved there in June 1773. Now, we don't know whether Mary Priestley, Joseph Priestley's wife, was particularly thrilled about the idea. She would have had to have uprooted and moved down to the southwest of the country. And she had a couple of children by that time as well, so they would have had to have moved house too. But anyway, the move was made. A little bit now about Shelburne and his property or properties. I'm going to talk about, he had more than one property, so I'm going to talk about those a little bit. Shelburne's main residence was Bowood House, which is pictured on the slide here, a Georgian country house that's located about halfway between Calne and Chippenham in Wiltshire, for anyone who knows the area. A large and imposing residence, as you can see from the picture. Its interiors were by Robert Adam, and the property had a garden designed by Capability Brown. The block on the right is referred to as the Big House, so that's the section over here, and that was actually demolished. Let me see, what year was that? That was demolished in 1956. Now, the wing on the left, starting with the short tower that you can see in the middle of the house there, that still remains. And it was at Bowood House that Priestley undertook some of his most important scientific work on gases. A little bit about William Petty Fitzmaurice. Now, I refer him alternately as Earl of Shelburne or Lord Shelburne, but he obviously has a lot of different ways in which his name can be written, and he was quite an aristocratic person. He was born in Dublin and spent his formative years in Ireland. But by the time Priestley was introduced to him, he was in England, and he was one of England's wealthiest members of the aristocracy. He served in the British Army during the 7 Years' War, and he became the leader of the Liberal group in the Whig Party. The Whigs themselves later became the Liberal Party when it merged with a couple of other groups, the Peelites and the Radicals, in the 1850s. So Shelburne was a supportive patron, and he was also interested in Priestley's scientific activities. He paid Priestley an annuity for the rest of his life. Priestley's day job entailed teaching Lord Shelburne's two sons, preparing parliamentary information for him, and cataloguing his extensive collection of books and manuscripts. I believe there was already another tutor who was in situ in Bowood House at the time, but this other tutor, who was Thomas Jervis, he was also a dissenter and son of a Presbyterian minister. So he and Priestley probably had quite a lot in common and things to talk about. Although my understanding is that they didn't ever overlap when they were teaching and educating the children, but they must have had an amicable arrangement, I think. So Shelburne also built a laboratory for Priestley, being aware of Priestley's scientific experimentation. And this was next to the library, so you can imagine Priestley would have been popping in and out of the library and getting fed up with cataloguing the books and so on, maybe, and going into his laboratory to do some experiments. And this picture, which probably many people have seen before, is of the lab which appears in the second edition of Priestley's publication, Experiments and Observations of Different Kinds of Air, that was published in 1775. So where did Priestley live when he was in Calne? Well, the Priestleys didn't reside in Bowood House, but they had two residences actually in Calne. The first was a multi-family house rented by Lord Shelburne, and it was located at 19 The Green. And this is nowadays referred to as the Priestley House. It wouldn't have been called that at the time, of course. And the Priestleys stayed there until July 1775. Priestley's second home in Calne was Parsonage House, and this was actually purchased by Shelburne. It's now, I think it's now the Old Vicarage in Calne, and it's Grade 2 listed. Described by Historic England as the Vicarage House originally constructed in the 1600s, in the 17th century. And Priestley moved in during 1775, so this was after his discovery of oxygen. When he moved in, apparently a pond was constructed outside the property, and there may have been others nearby too, maybe some natural ponds as well. And Priestley was able to set up a laboratory at the house, and he conducted experiments with gases collected from the underwater plants in the ponds, apparently. Priestley had been in Calne for a little over a year, and after this year of experimentation in Calne at Bowood House, he made his most famous discovery. He isolated a new air and found that a candle burned in this air with a remarkably vigorous flame. So I think we all know what this air was. In his own words, with this apparatus, after a variety of other experiments, an account of which will be found in the proper place, on the 1st of August 1774, I endeavoured to extract air from Mercurius calcinatus per se. And I presently found that by means of this lens, air expelled from it very, very readily. So he was using a burning lens, which we'll talk about. So Priestley's preparation of oxygen, I should say that this drawing shows the principle rather than how actually Priestley did this. But to produce the gas, Priestley heated red oxide of mercury, or mercury calx, also known as mercuric oxide, using a burning glass. And a burning glass was a double convex lens in this situation that focused sunlight onto the oxide. This produced mercury metal, which Priestley thought that phlogiston from the surrounding air must have been taken up by the calx, and so the air became dephlogisticated. Now, Priestley's science, as is a well-known story, all of this, of course, his science was incorrect. The mercuric oxide gave off oxygen, and Priestley believed in the theory of phlogiston, as most people did at the time. And that particular theory, of course, originated in 1669 with German chemist Georg Ernst Stahl, who was one of the people who was advocating phlogiston as the solution to a lot of chemistry and reactions. The theory postulated that the existence of a fire-like substance, phlogiston, was contained within combustible materials and released during combustion. Things would burn more brightly in dephlogisticated air since they could give up their phlogiston more readily, and it should be able to support life for longer. And Priestley's experiments confirmed both of these things, but of course the phlogiston theory was incorrect. Okay, so this is, we're going to talk a little bit about Priestley's burning glass in a little bit more detail now. In the 18th century, burning glasses provided reliable sources of heat for chemical experiments because they focused the sun's rays on an object, and Priestley often used a burning glass for his experiments. This is a photograph of one of Priestley's original burning glasses that's housed in the collection of Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And the text in the upper box says, "The large compound burning glass has been the least used but the most revered of the Priestley apparatus at Dickinson College, revered not only as a relic of a great man and a great discovery, but as a symbol for the college of its own unending search for truth. It is composed of two lenses, respectively 16 inches and 7 inches in diameter, set in a wooden frame which centers 16 inches apart. It was made by William Parker of Fleet Street. Now, this probably isn't the lens used by Priestley when he discovered oxygen. That is believed to have a diameter of 12 inches, which is what is reflected in the text straight from Priestley's Experiments and Observations publication that you see towards on the bottom of the screen here. And I think the Dickinson College, I don't know this for sure, but it's quite probable that it was actually the apparatus that Priestley had when he was once living in America, because Carlisle isn't terribly far from Northumberland, where Priestley was living at the time. So the properties of the new air. I'm going to show you a little video in a moment, and I'm hoping that this will come through all right. But the video itself is going to show a bit of, it's not red hot wood in this case, but that's what Priestley would have used at the time. It's a bit of, in fact, it's going to be using coal, hot coal, burned with and Priestley says it burned with a prodigious rapidity, exhibiting an appearance something like that of iron glowing with a white heat and throwing out sparks in all directions. And I'm very grateful to Fabio Parmigiani, who I think is on this call today, for providing me with a little video that we'll have a look at now. It's only just about a minute long. So this demonstration, this video demonstrates the hydropneumatic collection of oxygen over water and how the gas behaves when a piece of hot coal is exposed to it. So this is the collection of the oxygen that you're seeing at the moment. And Priestley, of course, would have used mercuric oxide heated by the use of a burning glass to generate the oxygen. The charcoal, or in this case, the coal, is preheated in a flame, and this is followed in a second or two, in a moment or two, by the deflagellation when the hot charcoal is dipped into the oxygen. And we're about to see that now, and I hope you'll be able to hear the crackling sound. Anyway, I'm sure even if the sound didn't come through very well, I'm sure you will have, you will have seen the effect of the oxygen on the intensity of the flame and how it was glowing very brightly. So, of course, Priestley had produced this new air, his dephlogisticated air, and he says that he says on the 8th of this month I procured a mouse, and he actually does he uses mice a lot. When I was doing the research for this talk, the number of occurrences of mice I came across and the things that he used to do to them sometimes were not always that pleasant. But anyway, on the 8th of this month, I procured a mouse and I put it into a glass vessel containing 2 ounces of the air from the heated mercurius calcinatus, mercury calx or mercuric oxide, of course. Had it been common air, a full-grown mouse, as this was, would have lived in it about a quarter of an hour. In this air, however, my mouse lived a full half hour, and though it was taken out seemingly dead, it appeared to have been only exceedingly chilled, for upon being held in the fire, it presently revived and appeared not to have received any harm from the experiment. I concluded that this air was between 4 and 5 times better, that is, more breathable, than the best common air I have ever tested. So, of course, Priestley, having tested dead out on mice, decided that he was going to try it out for himself. So my reader will not wonder that, after having ascertained the superior goodness of the dephlogisticated air by mice living it, I should have the curiosity to take it myself. I have gratified that curiosity by breathing it, drawing it through a glass siphon. The feeling of it to my lungs was not sensibly different from that of common air, but I fancied that my breast felt peculiarly light and easy for some time afterwards. Who can tell but that in time this pure air may become a fashionable article? Hitherto, only 2 mice and myself have had the privilege of breathing it. So he was quite brave, really, wasn't he? Because the air could have been quite nasty stuff. So concerning mice, a little bit more out of the same part of Priestley's experiments and observations, I found to my great surprise in the course of these experiments that mice will live entirely without water. For though I have kept them for 3 or 4 months and have offered them water several times, they would never taste it, and yet they continued in perfect health and vigour. 2 or 3 of them will live very peaceably together in the same vessel, though I had one instance of a mouse tearing another almost in pieces, and that was when there were plenty of provisions available for both of them. So some rather aggressive mice by the sounds of things, or maybe perhaps they were even just thirsty, who knows. So the naming of the air, Priestley says, as I think I have sufficiently proved that the fitness of the air for respiration depends upon its capacity to receive the phlogiston exhaled from the lungs, this species may not improperly be called dephlogisticated air. So the deal is done, or so we might think. Just to come back to Shelburne, and fittingly, Priestley dedicated the 2nd edition of his Experiments and Observations to the Right Honourable the Earl of Shelburne. This treatise is with the greatest gratitude and respect inscribed by his lordship's most obliged and obedient humble servant, J. Priestley. This brings me on to Shelburne's London property, in which Priestley also had a laboratory. Now, Shelburne would have gone there in the winter months. It's well documented that Shelburne, he left Calne and his country home, and he went to London during the winter time. And over the years, there have been hints and suggestions that Priestley discovered oxygen actually in this property in London. And even today, if you look at the webpage for the house, it states that in 1774, Shelburne's librarian, Dr. Priestley, was employed here when he discovered oxygen. Now, that doesn't categorically say that they believe that he discovered oxygen at Shelburne House. It's a little bit more than one way in which you could interpret that particular statement. So perhaps Priestley discovered oxygen in London. In 1933, Robert Caven, during a lecture given at the Institute of Chemistry on the occasion of the bicentenary of the birth of Joseph Priestley, says, Lord Brougham, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in his Life of Priestley, that was published in 1845, implies that the great experiment was performed at Lansdowne House, and the Dictionary of National Biography makes the same statement, which has been repeated by several other recent writers. Yet it is known that Priestley worked at Calne during the summer months as Sir Edward Thorpe, and Edward Thorpe, incidentally, he was the chief chemist of the British government at the time, as Sir Edward Thorpe states, and his own words indicate, and I can find no evidence that this particular experiment was done in London. However, if you go to the Dictionary of National Biography, it still says today that Priestley discovered oxygen whilst he was in London. But that was the only other occurrence that I managed to find that stated that. So why the confusion? Well, after Priestley's discovery, he departed pretty soon with Lord Shelburne, and they set off in the 3rd week of August. And bear in mind that Priestley's discovery was only on the 1st of August. And although he'd made his discovery, he hadn't really finished all the testing and experimenting that he wanted to do on oxygen or his dephlogisticated air. And anyway, he set off with Lord Shelburne, 3rd week of August, and they went on a tour of Europe, arriving in Paris in October 1774. So it took them a couple of months to get there by a circuitous route. According to Schofield, who is is Priestley's biographer, only John Waltire, an itinerant lecturer who had visited Priestley at Bowood in early August, and probably also provided the mercuric oxide that Priestley needed for his experiments, only John Waltire was aware of the experiments when Priestley left for Europe. And this quote in the middle is directly from Priestley's own records, so he does specifically mention Waltire. Mr. Waltire was a good chemist, a lecturer in natural philosophy, happening to be at that time in Calne. I explained my views to him, and he was furnished by him with many substances which I could not otherwise have procured. Priestley began to realise the importance of the discovery after more experimentation at his Lansdowne House laboratory, and wrote to Sir John Pringle, President of the Royal Society, with an update of his recent work. His findings were read to the Society, followed by publication of a letter, which was an account of further discoveries of air that was published in Philosophical Transactions in 1775. Although the focus of today is clearly on Priestley, I'm duty-bound to mention others who also have a claim on the discovery of oxygen. Carl William Scheele was a Swedish apothecary who discovered oxygen a few years before Priestley by heating a mixture of saltpeter and oil of vitriol, sulfuric acid, calling it fire air. Scheele wrote to Lavoisier explaining his findings, but his results were not published until 1777, after Priestley and Lavoisier had reported theirs. So Lavoisier himself, with probably all Antoine Lavoisier is, of course, widely considered to be the founder of modern chemistry, and he also has a claim on the discovery of oxygen or dephlogisticated air. And whilst he was on his travels with Lord Shelburne, Priestley met Lavoisier in Paris and described his experiment to produce the dephlogisticated air. Lavoisier repeated the experiment himself, taking a more quantitative approach, and dismissed the theory of phlogiston, which had previously been used to explain combustion and many other reactions. Lavoisier's hypothesis was that it was a gas and that he'd produced, and he ended up naming it oxygen, which means that which generates acids. So all three of them, Scheele, Priestley, and Lavoisier, can therefore be considered to be the discoverers of oxygen, but Priestley was the one who got there first by publishing his discovery first. Now, this is another little video which I'm not going to play because it's 15 minutes long, but I happened to come across it in archive.org, and it's absolutely fascinating for a number of reasons, partly because it was actually produced in 1946, and I didn't know that videos like this would have even been available at that time period. But it very clearly describes the production of oxygen, and it explains phlogiston very, very well too, for anyone who can get confused about it. It's quite easy to get a bit confused, I think, about phlogiston. And in Chemistry World, the Royal Society of Chemistry's Chemistry World, there was this wonderful cartoon that was published in the International Year of the Periodic Table 2019. And it's worth looking. It tells a story in a humorous way, but also is very illuminating at the same time. And it can be obtained on the website. I think even for non-RSE members, you should be able to get through to that cartoon. Priestley, however, never gave up on his belief in phlogiston, and he was still going on about it when he was in Pennsylvania he was there from 1794 to 1804, the last 10 years of his life. And you can see that this publication was from 1797, so he was definitely still writing and not willing to give up on his theory. I now want to just talk a little bit about pneumatic chemistry, because this was key to a lot of the work that Priestley did when he was experimenting with gases. Sorry, losing my place here for a moment. The founder of pneumatic chemistry is considered to be John Baptist van Helmont. And it was an area of scientific research that really became very important during the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. Important goals of pneumatic chemistry were the understanding of the physical properties of gases and how they relate to chemical reactions, and ultimately the composition of matter. And Boyle, Hooke, Mayo, Hales, Cavendish, and Priestley developed techniques and apparatus, but Priestley was definitely the most prolific. And he began his investigations with earthen troughs whilst he was at Leeds. John Mayo was the first to publish illustrations of equipment, and there was little significant change in the major components or techniques between his and Priestley's. And the pneumatic trough became the center of every gas chemist's laboratory, featuring a basin containing liquid over which gases could be collected. And Priestley began his investigations with earthen troughs while he was at Leeds. We've probably all seen this picture from Priestley's experiments and observations many times, but I decided for my own benefit as much as anything else to go through it and label all the major items, and this is the result. So Priestley made many improvements to apparatus first developed by others, and the inventory submitted by him after the Birmingham riots, which we're not going to talk about today, shows that by 1791 he had quite a collection of troughs. 8 were listed, including some very large ones. Troughs were made of earthenware or wood, and the smaller ones were used for mercury to limit the amount of mercury that was needed. Priestley used tubes made of leather, glass, and earthenware, and the type of pneumatic trough pictured here allowed gases to be collected and stored over water or over mercury. Priestley was the first to collect gases over mercury, the use of which allowed experiments involving water-soluble gases. So he was able to contain soluble gases like oxygen, hydrogen chloride, hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide, ammonia, and nitrous oxide, for example. His work with this setup included the isolation of hydrochloric acid and also ammonia. And here's another drawing, which I've partially labelled, of Priestley's laboratory in Calne. I showed this one a little bit earlier on, but I was particularly intrigued by the presence of a gun barrel in this picture. But the use that Priestley made of it was while he was trying to prepare fixed air, carbon dioxide, by heating limestone in it. But he found that the gas produced couldn't be absorbed by water and in fact burnt with a blue flame. So he'd made something else, and he'd actually made carbon monoxide. So where did Priestley get his apparatus from? Well, he obviously had a lot of apparatus, and he made some of it himself. When he began his investigations at Leeds, he used an earthen trough, and it was such a one as is there commonly used for washing linen. And he also had various other suppliers, like, for example, William Parker, who produced a lot of the lenses and glassware for him, and also Josiah Wedgwood, who we'll talk about in a moment. Glassware, and this is a quote from a paper by Lawrence Badash. Priestley was happily endowed with a large variety of sizes and shapes of glassware provided for him free by Mr. W. Parker, that's Mr. William Parker, manufacturer of cut glass and maker of philosophical instruments at 69 Fleet Street in London. This is not to say he did not make use of an occasional piece from Mrs. Priestley's kitchen, in particular a beer glass of 2 to 3 ounce measures of air capacity. 2 ounce measures of air capacity was often used to contain mice. And now I want to say a little bit about Josiah Wedgwood, who was one of the suppliers of equipment to Joseph Priestley. They were of a similar age and are believed to have met whilst Priestley was in Nantwich, because Nantwich is not a million miles from Stoke-on-Trent, probably about 15 miles actually from Stoke-on-Trent, where Wedgwood was actually based at the time. And there was considerable mutual respect between the two of them. And over the years, Wedgwood supplied everything Priestley needed in the way of pottery. So, for example, ceramic retorts. So Priestley wrote of Wedgwood's equipment that his retorts bear the greatest heats that I can give them, and his test tubes are capable of infinite uses in chemistry. Wedgwood seemed confident that many other scientists would agree, but there's a limited evidence as to the extent of Wedgwood's apparatus production. Some examples do exist, such as the retort pictured, and in 1772, Wedgwood published a sales catalogue of apparatus, suggesting some uptake within the scientific community. So Wedgwood and Priestley corresponded. For our exhibition in Nantwich Museum in 2019, the Wedgwood Museum loaned us original documents handwritten by Priestley and Wedgwood. Some were kindly transcribed by, I can't remember now for sure if it was people at the Wedgwood Museum. Maybe they already had transcriptions, but also we had some help from one of our museum volunteers as well. And the originals are stored at the Wedgwood Museum in Barlaston in Stoke. On the right-hand side of this slide, the quotes are a selection from Wedgwood's notes, and he did actually write extensive notes after he'd had a meeting with Priestley, for example. And it was, however, a two-way relationship. Priestley also helped Wedgwood with the chemical processes for producing colour when he was making pottery. So they had a very synergistic relationship, I guess you could say. As well as probably meeting in Nantwich or Stoke or even Newcastle under Lyme, which is definitely another possibility, Wedgwood was also a member of the Lunar Society, and they definitely knew each other through that connection as well. But that, of course, was later on because that was when Priestley was living in Birmingham. Priestley was a prolific writer, and his publications reflect his many interests, which include religion, theology, dissent, education, philosophy, and politics. So science was only one of his many interests. And over the course of his life, Priestley's religious writings were 4 times as numerous as his scientific writings. And these are just a few examples of other works, non-scientific works, I should say, really, that were published in 1774, the year that he discovered oxygen. Now, this is just a snapshot. It's not a comprehensive record. There were, I'm sure, many other publications that he produced during that time period. Robert Caven, who I mentioned before, during his 1933 speech at the Royal Institute of Chemistry, celebrating the bicentenary of Priestley's birth, said, "If he were not known as a great chemist, he would still be known as a pioneer of religious and civil liberty." So how is Priestley commemorated? Well, first of all, what better way to commemorate Priestley or anyone else from that matter is through statues. And here are a selection of them. So on the left, this is Birstall near Leeds. This is Priestley was born at nearby Fieldhead, and Peter's going to talk about this for us in a few minutes. And so this is the nearest statue to Priestley's birthplace. The second from the left is in Leeds. It's a statue that overlooks the current Unitarian chapel in Leeds from Leeds City Square, because the chapel that where Priestley was the minister, that one has been demolished, I believe. RSC members may be familiar with the sculpture of Priestley at Burlington House in London. The full-size version by Francis John Williamson is located in Birmingham, and that's the third one from the left. It was originally made of marble, then recast in bronze, and it portrays Priestley absorbed in an experiment, which led to his discovery of oxygen, with a bit of artistic license, I think, included. And then on the right-hand side, we've got 2 pictures, which are the Priestley on top of the door of what the building at 30 Russell Square that was formerly the Institute of Chemistry. And so he's sitting there looking a bit uncomfortable right above the door. But when you look at a close-up of him, he's shrouded by netting, presumably to keep the birds off. And I do feel particularly, he looks really fed up there, I think. And also the Institute of Chemistry no longer, of course, exists and isn't housed in that building anymore. So I think Priestley looks a little bit lonely there. Plaques, that's another way, and Peter knows a lot about plaques. I know Peter Morris, and our host today. But here are some of the plaques. If not, I don't know if I can't have got them all. In fact, one I definitely haven't got is one that is in Nantwich, because they put it on the wrong building. And this is something I will be trying to prove definitively in the coming months. I'm going to do some research going back to original sources to find out a bit more about what, to determine categorically where Priestley did live in Nantwich. I'm 99.5% of the way there, just got a few ends to tie up. These are approximately in chronological order. So the one on the top left is at the location where Priestley was born, and then bottom right is the Priestley House in Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and various other ones in between. Now, I used to work at the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology, was the actual university I worked at the time. And this is a picture of the main building hall at the university. And stained glass windows, another nice way to commemorate somebody, aren't they, really? And it was interesting because there were these 3 in a row. So we've got Davy and Perkin and Lavoisier and Bunsen who are having to share a window, but Priestley has got a window all to himself, and it's even a larger window, I think, than the other two. I do not know the reason why, because Priestley didn't have a particular connection with Manchester. And I was away a few months ago, on a short break, city break to Holland, going to Utrecht, and this building was present in Utrecht, and this was the former Organic, Chemical and Hygienic Laboratory at Utrecht University. No longer, it is no longer a university building. I think it's an administrative government building in the city. But there is Priestley, top left. You had to look up to spot him, but Sheila and Lavoisier are there too. We've also got the Joseph Priestley House Museum, Northumberland, Pennsylvania, which I think is the best of the tributes to Priestley. I think they've done a much better job in America, and I wish we had got something similar here in the UK. But it's one that I have been there, and it's really well worth a visit. And finally, I just want to mention, I showed you a video a little while ago about the production, generation and collection of oxygen, and also its combustion. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that we did publish a paper, myself, Fabio, and then some other co-workers as well, in Journal of Chemical Education. And that QR code will lead you to the publication. But the bad news is that it's not open access. But the good news is that if you can get through to it, you can see these demonstrations. There are recordings of all these little demonstrations that were performed live by Fabio at Nantwich Museum a few years ago. So on that note, that's all I wanted to say. I know I may have overrun by a few minutes, but hopefully we've still got time for Peter's little video and also for some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen, for a very interesting talk. We covered a great number of different things, including the apparatus and so forth. We've got just one question, which I will come to in a moment, which is an interesting question, but I'll come to that in a moment. For myself, it's partly a question and partly a comment. But even if we accept that he discovered oxygen and carbon, and I'm not 100% convinced about this, I know you and I will try and do some work on this when we've both got the time, but even if he did discover oxygen and carbon, there's a bit of an element of mystery about exactly where he found it, because reference has been made in chat to the International Chemical Landmark, which of course can be found in Bowood House, and I was there when it was presented. David Knight, the now deceased professor of the history of chemistry at Durham, did an absolutely wonderful talk where he claimed that Priestley had been vindicated by Davy, who showed that you don't need oxygen to make acid, but I digressed there. However, when I went to that celebration, I stayed in Priestley's house on the Green. It was for a fairly brief period a B&B. And my landlady in the B&B argued that her fireplace was an exact copy of the one that you showed a couple of times. She therefore argued that she must have done the experiment in her house. 18th century fireplaces look rather much alike. I'm not sure that's the strongest of arguments. My former colleague, might say my current colleague, Robert Budd, had argued that the laboratory was actually in the big house you mentioned, which was demolished in 1956. And so there's some argument about whether the current International Chemical Landmark really is where he works on oxygen. And we'll probably never know the complete truth on that. Robert Budd seemed quite convinced it was in the big house. It presented as being where it is now, a Bowood House. Who knows? We've got one question, which is, do you have any comment on that, Helen, before I move on to the question?
I think very briefly, yes. I think Priestley, my understanding is he didn't have a laboratory of his own until 1775 or 6, when he moved into the second home that he occupied in Calne. So, apparently he did have a laboratory established there. but not in 1774 when he discovered oxygen. So I'm still on the side of the oxygen being discovered actually in Bowood House, I'm afraid. But I'm happy to, if we can find more evidence, that's certainly something that I'd be happy to follow up with.
Yeah. Okay, now the question is, and it's by Colin Johnson, who used to be the director of Technical Quest in Cardiff. I've long had a totally untested hypothesis that these earthen pneumatic troughs were saggars, which is spelled Saggars, i.e. the safeguard used in pottery kiln. Is there any evidence for this? Friendship with redwood tend to support my theory. You said, of course, it was used for washing. You want to make any comment on that about the origin of the troughs?
Not much in the way of comments, except that I think Priestley got his troughs from all sorts of different places. I think that the one that might have been used for washing was probably because maybe he didn't have, that was probably early in his experimentation phase before he was in the more, perhaps in Calne where money was probably less of an object, I suggest. And I think he was making use of domestic equipment as much so the washing bowl or whatever that may have been available to him in the kitchen or whatever at the time. So certainly in Leeds, he wasn't well endowed, I don't think, with equipment. It was very much his not his day job.
He probably didn't know Wedgwood then, did he? Because he really
he probably did, actually. He probably did know Wedgwood, because I think he got to know Wedgwood whilst he was in Nantwich. So it may well be that he did know Wedgwood, but I don't think Priestley wasn't set on the experimentation so much. He got it. He was. Well, he was in the sense that he was experimenting with carbon dioxide, but he didn't. He was getting much more regimented, I think, about it when he got to Calne in Wiltshire. So it's not a question I can answer directly, but an interesting one nevertheless.
Okay, we do have one last question here. I presume it's going to be a last question. Do you know the names of any of the pupils in Nantwich? Do you know the name of any pupils in Nantwich?
Now there is one, because Priestley ended up marrying Mary Wilkinson, and he met Mary through one of the pupils in Nantwich, whose first name I have forgotten, but it was a boy, obviously, who, well, although Priestley did teach girls as well as boys, but it was a boy who attended Priestley's school, and that was how he got to know Mary. But all I can say is that the last name was Wilkinson. I may well have a record somewhere of what his first name was, but I don't have that to hand, I'm afraid.
Anne Wilkinson, of course, was the daughter of the famous iron founder, wasn't she?
Yeah, Mary, yes, she was. Isaac Wilkinson, yes, yes. So from the Wrexham area.
Yes, okay. So well, thank you very much again, Helen, for a wonderful talk. You've had up to 52 people today, so good turnout yet again. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. But before you all rush off, and particularly if you've left already, I'm going to show you a very short presentation by myself, which is the record, if you like, of a trip I made yesterday. Because yesterday I pressurized to some extent by Helen, who said, "Oh gosh, you're so terribly close to Birstall, you've got to go there." Where Priestley was born which was actually in a tiny place called Fieldhead, which is just immediately north of Birstall. Birstall, for those of you who don't know Yorkshire, is actually south of Leeds. Unfortunately and sadly, it's where Jo Cox was murdered in 2016. In fact, all the flowers marking her murder were placed at the base of Priestley's statue in Birstall. But Fieldhead is north of the main town. And I went and visited it yesterday when it was decent weather, unlike today, which is dreadful. And here you can see the house, you can see the plaque here, you can see the sky aerial, and you can see the bins in front. I felt emboldened to stand on the steps of the house because there was a note on the door saying, "Please leave the parcel in the garden," which made me think that the owner was out. So I was sufficiently emboldened to stand there. So you can see the plaque here. I don't quite know how well you can read it, but it says Joseph Priestley, discoverer of oxygen. Can't read the next bit actually. AD 1733. Now, of course, as is well known, this is a wider view of the house, and as you can see, it borders onto the road, the main road. The lane it stands in is called Owler Lane. But this is not the original house, because if you look at the picture of the original house, you can see that it was a lower house and it had some kind of outbuilding, which was probably where his father stored his cloth, because his father was a finisher of woven wool. Wool in those days, particularly in places like Yorkshire, was done at home. So the original working from home. And it was done in piecework. In other words, you were given so many pieces of cloth to work on, you would finish them or you do whatever you did, weave them, whatever your part in the process was, and then you gave them back to the middleman and he gave you some more. So it's the origin of both working from home and piecework. And this is what his father did, and that sort of outhouse that looks a bit like a garden shed, but a brick one, is probably where he stored the cloth he was working on. This house was demolished. Quite why this house was demolished, I'm not entirely sure. Unfortunately, on my screen, you can't actually see the house next door, so I've moved the sort of speakers over to the other side, and I'm hoping that you can now see the house on the right here. Now that's of some interest because I took a picture of the house next door, and if you look at the house next door, the brick is clearly much older than in the house part of the building where Priestley was born. And you can also see, if I go back again, you can see that the chimney there is the same. And you've got one window on the first floor and another window on the ground floor. And that also corresponds to what we have here. So I think we can fairly confidently say that the house next door is the original. You can also see that the house that replaced Priestley's house is slightly higher than it. And again, if we go back, you can see that Priestley's house was actually much lower than that house. I mean, it must have been incredibly low. The first floor, you must have almost had to crawl around in the first floor, unless the roof base was open, possibly. So there we are. That was where Priestley lived, whether you call it a grand house. I mean, if you look at it in terms of the modern house, you can see that it's now actually two houses. So I guess although the roof was much lower, it was quite a reasonable sized house, but probably full of cloth being worked upon, so maybe not entirely comfortable. And here you can see the lane itself with my back to the main road. Where this lane goes to, I have no idea. It seems to peter off into the countryside for quite some distance. But you can see that you are even today in the countryside, although about 200, well, no, about 100 yards north of this lane, in other words, to the left in this picture, is the M52. So it's incredibly close to the M52. It takes about 20 minutes between Pontefract and Birstall. But there you are, Priestley's birthplace today. And I wish you all, let me stop the share. I wish you all a very good afternoon. And I hope you all come back to our next talk in September, because we'll all take a break in August. And in September we'll have, and unfortunately I'm away from home and I don't have the list of talks on me, but if my memory serves me correctly, it will be the Australian historian chemist V. Corrin talking about Tyrian purple. So we go from Priestley to the biblical purple, appropriate in some way. So once again, thank you, Helen, and thank you all very much for coming along. And I wish you all have a good summer holidays. And I hope to see you. Please do come back in September, where we'll be talking to you once again. Bye for now, everyone. Bye for now. So one new message, probably just saying great talk or something. Yeah, interesting photos. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.